Hi, my name is Alethea Arnaquq-Baril, and this is my son Anugal. We are Inuit from Iqaluit in Nunavut, and we're reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report from pages 264 to 267. The title of the section is The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, an Emerging Model. Archives may be viewed with distrust by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Many feel that much of their lives is contained in documents, most of which they've never seen, kept by the state in order to study and categorize them in a depersonalized way. In various ways, existing archives have been ill-suited to serve the needs of survivors, their families, and communities. What Aboriginal peoples required was a center of their own, a cultural space that would serve as both an archive and a museum to hold the collective memory of survivors and others whose lives were touched by the history and legacy of the residential school system. With this understanding, the TRC mandate called for the establishment of a new National Research Center, NRC, to hold all the historical and newly created documents and oral statements related to residential schools and to make them accessible for the future. This NRC, as created by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and now renamed the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, NCTR, is an evolving, survivor-centered model of education for reconciliation. Implementing a new approach to public education, research, and record-keeping, the center will serve as a public memory, site of conscience, bearing permanent witness to survivors' testimonies and the history and legacy of the residential school system. Along with other museums and archives across the country, the center will shape how the residential school era is understood and remembered. The concept of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has deep roots. For many years, survivors and their supporters called for a center that would be their lasting legacy to their own history and to Canada's national memory. In March 2011, the TRC hosted an international forum in Vancouver, Sharing Truth, creating a national research center on residential schools, to study how records and other materials from Truth and Reconciliation Commissions around the world have been archived. Several speakers talked about their vision for the NCTR. George Erasmus, former co-chair of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and then president of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, said, "Those who become the keepers of the archives become stewards of human stories and relationships, of what has been an endowment to what will be. Because no legacy is enriched by counterfeit, a nation is ill-served by history which is not genuine. This is a high calling indeed, and it must be said that too often the promise and the potential of this stewardship has gone unrealized. If the stories of our people are not accessible to the general public, it will be as if their experiences never occurred. And if their voices are rendered as museum pieces, it will be as if their experience is frozen in time. What we need are open, dynamic, interactive spaces and participatory forms of narrative, knowledge, and research. This would be a fitting way to step into the 21st century and into a new kind of relationship. The National Research Center ought to be a treasure valued by all sorts of people." The Commission subsequently issued an open invitation for organizations to submit proposals for the NCTR based on specific criteria. In June 2013, the TRC announced that the University of Manitoba would house the new center. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation will play a key educational role in ensuring that the historic harms and treaty, constitutional and human rights violations against Aboriginal peoples are not repeated. As a highly visible site of conscience, it will serve as an intervention in the country's public memory and national history. The center is independent from government. It is guided by a governing circle, the majority of whose members must be Aboriginal and which includes survivor representatives. Among its various responsibilities, this governing body will make decisions and provide advice on ceremonies and protocols and establish a survivors' circle. The center will house TRC records, including survivors' oral history statements, artworks, expressions of reconciliation, and other materials gathered by the Commission, as well as government and church documents. It is intended to be a welcoming and safe place for survivors, their families, and communities to have access to their own history. The Centre has committed to creating a culturally rooted and healing environment where all Canadians can honor, learn from, and commemorate the history and legacy of the residential schools. Once the Centre is fully operational, it will be well positioned to take a leadership role in forging new directions in residential school and Indigenous rights-based research, establishing new standards and benchmarks for archival and museum policy, management, and operations based on Indigenous and Western principles and best practices. The University of Manitoba and its partners have emphasized that the Centre recognizes the paramount importance of accessibility for the Aboriginal survivor, family member, or researcher, and is committed to recognition of Aboriginal Aboriginal peoples as co-creators of the IRS records through co-curation and participatory archiving, and committed to continuing the work of the TRC of statement gathering, public education, engagement, and outreach. The NCTR will incorporate an archival system, an approach which is devoted to reconciling records. It will support Indigenous frameworks of knowledge, memory, and evidence, and reposition Indigenous communities as co-creators of archival records that relate to them, including government archives. Such approaches acknowledge rights in records that extend beyond access to working in partnership with archival institutions to manage appraisal, description, and accessibility of records relating to Indigenous communities. The Centre is committed to establishing trust with Aboriginal communities by working with these communities to realize their own goals through participatory archiving. The process of participatory archiving, interacting with as complete a record as possible, will be a powerful force for reconciliation and healing. As well, the Centre for Truth and Reconciliation is also committed to personally supporting survivors, their families, and all researchers in navigating, using, and understanding the records in a culturally sensitive environment. The support that the NRC will provide includes emotionally sensitive support, acknowledging that accessing the NRC documents may be traumatic, difficult, or otherwise emotional experiences for many users. An elder will be present or on call from a nearby building. Most of the time, the NRC is open to the public. LAC and other government departments have no mandate or capacity to offer these various supports, which are critical to relationship building and overcoming the perception of archives as yet another mechanism of colonization, cultural appropriation by Western society, and hyper-surveillance and objectification of Aboriginal peoples. On June 21, 2013, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis survivors, elders, the TRC, and the University of Manitoba and its partner institutions, along with other dignitaries, gathered in Treaty 1 territory of the Anishinaabe peoples and homeland of the Métis Nation for a signing ceremony at the University of Manitoba. The signing of a trust deed with the university marks a transfer of sacred trust, a solemn promise that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission made to survivors and all those affected by the residential schools as it traveled across the country, bearing witness to their testimonies. The NCTR is committed to making all its holdings readily accessible to survivors, their families, and communities, as well as to the public, educators, and researchers. To support reconciliation at the local level, the Commission believes it will be especially important to ensure that communities are able to access the Centre's holdings and resources in order to produce histories of their own residential school experiences and their involvement in the truth, healing, and reconciliation process. The Centre will be a living legacy, a teaching and learning place for public education to promote understanding and reconciliation through ongoing statement gathering, new research, commemoration ceremonies, dialogues on reconciliation, and celebrations of Indigenous cultures, oral histories, and legal traditions. Calls to action. We call upon provincial, territorial, municipal, and community archives to work collaboratively with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to identify and collect copies of all records relevant to the history and legacy of residential school system, and to provide these to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. We call upon the Government of Canada to commit to making a funding contribution of $10 million over over 7 years to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, plus an additional amount to assist communities to research and produce histories of their own residential school experience and their involvement in truth, healing, and reconciliation.